master gives his servants a direct command. He gives them this money and he tells them, do business with this until I return. Occupy till I come. Here, it's occupy in the sense of conduct your occupation. Occupy till I come. The master says, here's some money. Do something. How often do we consider the fact that God has made us not only stewards of our bank account, of our abilities, of our opportunities, God has made us stewards of His creation. If you have your Bibles, turn with me to the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 19. As we continue our Cultivate series, Luke chapter 19 is where we're going to be, and you'll find a story there. You'll find a man talking to his servants. I need to go away for a while, he tells them. I need to go away for a while to secure the throne for myself. But one day I'm coming back, and when I come back, I'm going to be the king. Until then, I want you to carry on my business in my absence. Now, perhaps to you that seems like a strange thing for a prince to say. Most of the time in our minds, in our expectations, royalty has its privileges. I mean, we don't have kings around here, right? We got rid of those a long time ago. But we still know what it's like. We remember what it was like to have a king, if not ourselves, our country. We also know other people who still have kings and queens and royals. We've actually lived through, in our own lifetimes, we have lived through the coronation of a new king after the death of a long-reigning queen. We know how it works. We've seen it happen. And if we didn't know what was going on, trust me, all you had to do back during the transition in England, all you had to do is turn on the TV and all of the news channels. There were countless pundits and royal watchers on tap to fill 24 hours a day telling you who was going to be the next king and how it was going to happen. We know the details. We've seen how it works. And to us, lines of succession are clearly and well established. And we knew who the next king was going to be long before Elizabeth passed. We knew who was going to be king. But in Jesus' day, that wasn't always the case. In Jesus' day, there were few positions less certain than that of prince. Because every time there was a transition between kings and monarchs, yes, there was that one person who's supposed to be the king, but there are also lots of opportunities to make sure that prince did not become king. One prince could be assassinated and another prince elevated to heir apparent at any point in the process. And especially if you were in a small country like Judea, Israel, all of the kings and princes owed their position to the permission of the emperor in Rome. You didn't get to be king without his say-so. In fact, it was so tenuous, it was so uncertain a position in the days of Augustus that the Emperor Augustus is rumored to have joked about it, saying it would be better to be one of King Herod's sows than to be one of his sons. It'd better to be a pig in the court of Herod the Great than to be a prince. And so it was, when King Herod the Great died somewhere around the year 4 BC, the unrest that followed his death lived up to all those expectations. Just before his death, in his final months, King Herod was something of a paranoid. And right before his death, King Herod had ordered that they place a golden eagle, an image of a golden eagle, the symbol of Rome, above the entrance to the temple in Jerusalem as a symbol and a sign of Jerusalem's loyalty to the emperor. But the Jews in Jerusalem did not see it that way at all. To the Jews in Jerusalem, they saw that as a symbol of idolatry, and obviously they objected to it. And it wasn't long before two vandals were climbing up on the posts of that door frame and chopping that golden eagle down with a pair of axes. In the aftermath of that desecration in the mind of Herod the Great, in the aftermath of that desecration, Herod ordered the arrest of two teachers of the law in Jerusalem and 40 of their students. And together, those two teachers and those 42 students were burned alive to punish them for the insult of tearing down that golden eagle. Once that was done, Herod the Great retired to his summer palace in Jericho, and he cleaned up his own house. Many of his sons, through a couple of his wives, traced their ancestry back to the Hasmoneans, the family that established the Maccabean dynasty. They were Jewish royalty, and he didn't want them taking over after he died, so he ordered the execution of any of his offspring that trace their genealogy back to the Maccabees. And then he changed his will, selecting his son Archelaus by his fourth wife, Malthace. He elevated Archelaus to his royal heir, replacing Archelaus' brother Antipas, who up until that point had been next in line to the throne. And then he died. Herod the Great died just before the Passover that year, 4 BC. And Archelaus prepared to take his throne in Jerusalem. He got all dressed up in brilliant white robes. And he had a large golden throne brought out, and he ascended up to his throne there in Jerusalem to greet his new subjects, and he wanted them to like him. So right off the bat, he told them, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut your taxes. Sound familiar? First thing I'm going to do is cut your taxes, and then I'm going to order the release of all those political prisoners my father had locked away. He thought everyone would love that idea. But the people were interested in far more than just lower taxes and freed prisoners. They wanted justice, especially for the immolation of those two teachers and their 40 students. And they began demanding that if you really want to be our king, we want you to hunt down all the people that participated in burning those people to death and put them to death for that crime. And pretty soon a mob was gathering in the temple courts demanding justice for the slain. And Archelaus selected two representatives, one of them a general, one of them a commander of one of the army cohorts. He selected two representatives to go to the temple and try to reason with the angry mob. But when they got to the temple, the mob wasn't interested in reasoning with them. They started picking up rocks, and they stoned those two delegates to death right there outside the temple. And at that point, Archelaus said, fine, if that's how it's going to be. He ordered all of his soldiers in Jerusalem to go into the temple courts and to cleanse that place. And soon more than 300 Jewish people, Jewish men who'd gathered at the temple simply to offer their sacrifices, lay dead in the temple courts. And the king sent out his heralds all over Jerusalem to announce that this year, that's how you're going to behave. Passover is canceled. And then he prepared to leave. Remember, You don't get to be king without the permission of the emperor. So Archelaus prepared to head to Rome and present his case and appear before the emperor and to officially be appointed king in his father's place. He went to go and see Augustus, and as he was making that journey, messengers from his brother Antipas, you remember the one that had been heir to the throne but had been replaced by this dubious will just days before Herod the Great's death. Antipas was already dispatching messengers of his own to go and seek an audience with Augustus and to tell Augustus all about the riot in the temple and the massacre of those 3,000 Jewish worshipers, and to tell Augustus that was proof that he, Antipas, not Augustus, was the rightful successor to his father's throne. All that had just happened within the lifetime of most of the audience there listening as Jesus told a story on his way to Jerusalem. When Jesus told a story about a noble who had to travel to a far-off country to secure for himself a kingship, that was not only a believable premise, that was a headline ripped straight from the newspaper not too long ago. And the story, as Jesus told it, is found in the 19th chapter of Luke. Do you have your Bibles open? We're just about there. It's in Luke chapter 19, and if you look at Luke chapter 19, you'll discover that this story is sandwiched in between two really familiar scenes. It comes right after Jesus departs Jericho. It comes right after Jesus looks into the shade of that sycamore tree and says, "Zacchaeus, why don't you get out here? Because I'm going to your house today." It comes right after the story of Zacchaeus. It comes right before Jesus' followers start taking off their cloaks and placing them on the ground and waving their palm branches to welcome Jesus' arrival into Jerusalem. Right after his departure from Jericho, right before his triumphal entry, Luke tells us this story that Jesus told. Luke chapter 19, starting at verse 11. Luke chapter 19, starting at verse 11, Luke writes, as they listened to this, Jesus told them another parable because he was near Jerusalem. And they thought that God's kingdom would appear right away. He said, "A certain man who was born into royalty went to a distant land to receive his kingdom and then return. He called together 10 servants, and he gave each of them money worth 4 months' wages. And he said, 'Do business with this until I return.' Well, the citizens hated him. So they sent a representative after him who said, 'We don't want this man to be our king.' But after receiving his kingdom, he returned and he called his servants, the servants to whom he had given the money, to find out how much they had earned. Well, the first servant came forward and said, 'Your money has earned a return of 1,000%. And the king replied, 'Excellent. You are a good servant. Because you've been faithful in this small matter, you'll have authority over 10 cities.' The second servant came and said, 'Master, your money has made a return of 500%. And to this one, the king said, 'You will have authority over 5 cities.' And another servant came and said, 'Master, here's your money. I wrapped it up in a scarf for safekeeping. I was afraid. I was afraid of you because you are a stern man. You withdraw what you haven't deposited, and you harvest what you haven't planted. And the king replied, I will judge you by the words of your own mouth, you worthless servant. You knew, did you, that I'm a stern man, withdrawing what I didn't deposit and harvesting what I didn't plant? Well, why then didn't you put my money in the bank? Then when I arrived, at least I would have gotten it back with interest. And he said to his attendants, take his money and give it to the one who has 10 times as much. But master, they replied, he already has 10 times as much. And he replied, I say to you that everyone who has will be given more, but from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. And as for my enemies who didn't want me as their king, bring them here and slaughter them before me. They all lived happily. I guess it doesn't say that, does it? Shall we pray? It's a dangerous thing, Father, to think about a story we know so well that we don't think there's anything for us to learn from it. Spirit, give us fresh eyes to see and fresh ears to hear what your word says. Help us to hear you rather than just what we already think we know. And then help us to do something with it so that it produces a return. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. A man born to royalty has to go to a far-off country and to have his claims to the throne confirmed by a foreign power. Meanwhile, back home, he faces opposition from some of the people living in the land that he is seeking to rule. They want to prevent his elevation and keep him from becoming king. That had never happened, you could almost hear Jesus say, can't you? You'd never expect something like that to happen around here, would you? Not only do those circumstances sound familiar to us, who understand what happened to Archelaus and Antipas, the story itself sounds pretty familiar. Most of us know all about the parable of the talents, right? From Matthew's gospel, Matthew chapter 25. Based on the unit, that's why they call it the parable of the talent. Here's one of those fascinating things. When we hear the word talent, we think of a skill or ability, right? Did you know that the English word talent as skill or ability came from the word talent, a measure of weight, because of the parable? It wasn't that Jesus chose talents because it could mean both things. It was after Jesus talked about these weights of money that talent came to mean other things as well. Interesting how English works like that. But we know that story based on the weight of the money the master gave his servants. But there are differences we need to pay attention to here between Matthew and Luke. Everybody loves the parable of the talents because that word talent is so convenient. All of us have talents that we can use for the glory of God and for the good of our world, right? Right? That wasn't a trick question. All of us have talents and abilities we can use for the glory of God and the good of the world, right? Yeah. The danger is because we're so familiar with the story in Matthew, we don't listen carefully when it comes up in Luke. I know the punchline. I've heard this one before. But there's some important differences between these two stories, aren't there? I mean, first, in Luke's story, there are 10 servants, not just 3. You caught that, right? Also, In Luke's story, unlike Matthew's, they're all given the same amount. It's not like one guy gets 10 and one guy gets 5 and one guy gets 1 according to their abilities, like Jesus says in Matthew. 10 servants each get the same amount in Luke's version, and the amount they receive is considerably less than the amount that Matthew uses. There are 3 servants. One gets 10 talents, one gets 5 talents, one gets 1 talent, and everybody asks, what in the world is a talent? A talent is a measure of weight. 1 talent is equivalent to approximately 75 pounds, most of the time of silver. Okay? So one guy gets 750 pounds of silver. Even the guy that only got 75 pounds of silver. That's an extravagant amount, right? But in Luke's version, the master gives each servant a single mina, M-I-N-A, a mina. And all God's people said, what in the world's a mina? Well, in the coinage of the Greek Empire, a drachma, that's a Greek coin. A drachma was roughly what a day laborer could expect to be paid for a single day's work. A drachma is a day's wage. The Latins, the Romans, called that coin a denarius. It's about the same amount. But drachma, denarius, the Greeks called it a drachma. The Greeks had another coin called the mina. The drachma was 1 day's wage. A mina was worth 100 drachma. 100 days' wages, or just barely less than what you could earn by working for 4 months with Sundays off, or Saturdays, right? With Saturdays off. That's why the Common English Bible I read from today said he gave them each 4 months' wages. That's how much a mina was worth. You say, well, that doesn't help me because we're comparing it to talents. A talent was worth roughly 60 minas, or 600 drachma. It's the difference between 4 months' wages and a 20-year salary. Or, for the lucky guy that got 10 of them, 200 years salary. In Luke's version of the story, the amount that's entrusted to each of the servants is far more ordinary and far more routine. And in some ways, I kind of like that. Because I can never imagine somebody walking up to me and handing me a talent of silver. But I've got minas. I can imagine being entrusted with a mina. It's ordinary. Anyone could imagine being entrusted with that much. Another important difference between Luke's version and Matthew's version is that in Luke's version, the master gives his servants a direct command. In Matthew, it's just kind of implied. In Luke, it is explicit. He gives them this money and he tells them, in the Common English Bible's translation of it, he tells them, do business with this until I return. I still like the way the King James puts it. Occupy till I come. Here, it's occupy in the sense of conduct your occupation. Occupy till I come. The word that Luke uses to translate Jesus' story here is pragmatuomai. Pragmatuomai. We get our English word pragmatics from that root. If dogmatics refers to what we believe, pragmatics refers to what we do. Pragmatic advice is advice that you can put to work and do something with it. That's the root of this verb. The master says, here's some money. Do something because I'm coming back. And at this point, Luke tells us there is some opposition to the master's elevation to the throne. There are some citizens in the country who aren't happy that this master is heir to the throne, and they want to do whatever they can to keep that from happening. What isn't spelled out but is lurking there behind the scenes of that story is that means there's some risk to conducting business in the master's name during his absence. Whatever they choose to do with that mina, they have to do, it's the master's mina, they have to do it in the master's name. And now the master is gone. The master is no longer present to lend his servants an air of importance. Perhaps more importantly, the master's bodyguards are no longer around to offer them a measure of protection. These servants are sent out into a hostile world with a 4 days' wages worth of money and told, do business in my name till I get back. And if they don't like the master, they're not going to like the servants either. Seems like Jesus says something like that at some point in the gospel. So at that point, we jump forward in the story to the master's return. He comes back home a king. The smear campaign against him didn't work, just like Antipas's didn't work. He comes back a king and he summons his servants in to find out what they did with his money. The Common English Bible we read from this morning says he called them, he wanted to find out how much they had earned. The verb that Luke uses to translate Jesus' story here is dia pragmatuomai. And if that sounds familiar to you, it should, because it's that same word from 2 verses earlier, pragmatuomoi, do something with it, and it attaches the prefix dia, that means through. He wants to find out what happened through their doing something with his money. What was the result? And here the story whittles down from 10 servants to just 3. The first servant comes in and says, the master's investment has made 10 more. Your 1 mina produced 10 more. Or as the Common English Bible puts it, the return on investment here is 1,000%. 10 times, 1,000% return. I wish my retirement would do that. We'd be in good shape, wouldn't we? Second servant comes in. Well, let's not skip ahead. First servant comes in, he says, your 1 mina has produced 10 more, and the master replies, well done, you've been a good servant. Because you've been faithful in this small matter, I will trust you with more responsibility. Take charge of 10 cities. I gave you 1 mina, you made 10 minas. Now I'm giving you 10 cities. I want you to be in charge of 10 cities in my kingdom. Now you see why mina is more appropriate to Luke's version of the story than Matthew's, because nobody calls a 75-pound bag of silver, let alone a 750-pound pile of silver, a small matter. A mina is a small matter. You've been faithful in a small matter. Now I'm going to put you in charge of many things. The second servant likewise reports success, not to the same extent as the first, but there's still success. In this case, the master's investment has yielded a 500% return. The 1 mina invested has produced 5 more, and the master, seeing the faithfulness of his servant, tells his servant that you're going to be given charge of 5 cities in my kingdom. And then comes the third servant. And the third servant, in my notes I wrote down, the third servant makes excuses. I'm not sure if that's the case. The third servant had excuses and did what he thought was best. He said, I was afraid. I was afraid of you because you're a hard man. Withdrawing where you haven't deposited and harvesting where you haven't planted. In other words, you're the kind of guy that has enemies. And I realized that if I wasn't careful, your enemies would come and steal your money. It was risky doing business in your absence, and so I did my very best to keep your money safe to make sure you didn't lose anything. I protected it for you, Master. I made sure no one could steal your money. I took your coin and I wrapped it up in my scarf and I hid it away. And see, here it is. Every cent, every drachma, nothing missing, all present and accounted for. The master tells him, you're going to be judged by your own words. You knew that I was a hard man, did you? An anthropos austeros, an austere, that's where we get that word austere from. You heard I was an austere man? You heard I was a stern person? Well, why didn't you do what you'd expect a stern person to do with his money? If that's the kind of guy you think I am, why didn't you do the kind of thing you would expect me to do? You say, I withdraw where I haven't deposited. Why didn't you deposit it? Why don't you just give it to the bankers so at least it could earn some interest? The master ordered that one servant be stripped of that one coin. And that one mina be given to the guy that had 10 others. Well, 11 others, counting the one the master started with. And in this story, Jesus teaches us a lesson about stewardship, doesn't he? You probably know all of them. You probably could teach this lesson yourself if you wanted to. But just in case you need a refresher on any of this, this story reminds us of some important truths. First of all, it reminds us that my stuff isn't my stuff. It's all the master's. What I have, he has given me. Not only is my stuff not my stuff, my success isn't my success. My glory rightly belongs to God. When those servants get called in to report on what they've done, remember what the first servant said. The first, man, I worked really hard, and here's what my work has done, right? That's not what he says. He says to his master, your mina, your coin, your investment has produced 10 more. You get the credit because you gave me what I started with. It all belongs to you. All glory belongs to you. My stuff is his stuff. My glory is rightly his glory. My responsibility is faithfulness. Notice when the master commends that first servant, he says, excellent, you are a good servant because you have been profitable in your business. Right? Look at my head, as my friend George would say. There's the right answer. He does not say, well done because you've been profitable. He says, well done because you have been faithful. Because you have been faithful. The commendation wasn't based on the results. It was on the faith that gave rise to the results in the end. Faithfulness is what the master expects. The master says, do something, and the servant that did something was commended for obedience. If faithfulness is what the master expects, the opposite of faithfulness is fear. And the third servant was fearful of all the wrong things. He said to his master, I was afraid of you, but really, what he was afraid of was everybody else. You've got enemies. It wasn't safe for me to conduct business in your name. Because I was afraid of what they might do. I hid your coin away so I could give it back to you when you came back. This third servant was more concerned about the opinions of others than the orders of his master. If we wanted to, we could just park right there for a while. Probably a sermon in that. But the fifth lesson is that God is looking from his servants, or the master in this story. The master was not just looking for maintenance. The master was looking for multiplication. It wasn't just, here is this, keep it safe and make sure you give it back to me when I get back. The master wanted the servant to do something with what he had been given, so when he came back, there would be more. It would be better. It would be multiplied. Now, if we wanted to, we should be able to apply these lessons to our own stewardship. Whether we're thinking about how we use the financial resources God has given us, or how we exercise the talents and abilities He has graced us with, or even how we make the most of the opportunities that He has provided for us each day. We can apply those lessons of stewardship to our individual lives and our individual resources. But today's sermon isn't a generic sermon on stewardship. We're studying the covenant of Christian conduct from the Church of the Nazarene, right? That is what this whole series is about. And the paragraph we're looking at today isn't about what we do with our money or how we manage our abilities. The paragraph we're looking at today is about a very specific type of stewardship. Specifically, our stewardship of God's good creation. Covenant Christian Conduct, the manual of the Church of the Nazarene, chapter 28.9 says this: we call our people to care for creation. God pronounced the original creation to be good, and He appointed humanity to steward creation for God's greater purposes. Care for this created world includes such things as avoiding lifestyles of pollution and of unnecessary consumption of goods and resources. Notice that statement speaks of stewardship. The way we engage God's created world is an aspect of our service as His stewards. We don't have a hard time understanding that the money in my bank account is God's, so I need to be careful what I do with it. We don't have a hard time understanding that the talents that I've been graced with is God's, and so I should use it for His glory and the good of my world. We really might not always recognize it, but we have no problem imagining that the opportunities that each day holds are to be used for God's purposes. But how often do we consider the fact that God has made us not only stewards of our bank account, of our abilities, of our opportunities, God has made us stewards of His creation. It's been there all along. This has been a part of humanity's calling from the very beginning. Whether in Genesis chapter 1, where the first blessing God gives humanity is the command to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it and rule. Be the stewards of my authority in this world that I have made, both of you together. This is important. This is a different sermon, not today's sermon, but all of those verbs are plural. God doesn't say to the man, I want you to be fruitful, I want you to multiply, I want you to fill the earth, I want you to subdue it, and say to the woman, if you want to, you can help him do what he has to do. Those commands are spoken to both of them, and it is a shared responsibility. Both of you be fruitful, both of you increase in number, both of you fill the earth, both of you subdue it, and both of you exercise my authority in the world. Be the stewards of my authority over what I've made. It's there in Genesis chapter 1. It's there in Genesis chapter 2. When God takes the human one, Ha-Adam, the human, and He places the human in the garden, and He tells him to work it and to take care of it. Here I like the King James. To dress and to keep it. To cultivate it and care for it. It's not just that God's stuff is my stuff, Bible teaches all stuff is God's stuff. And God's stuff is good stuff. Humans might misuse and abuse the world that God has made. Humans might take things that God has made and use it for their own purposes rather than His purposes. But God's creation itself is good. In fact, it's not just good. God steps back and says, you know what, this is very good. But as good as God's world is, as good as God's creation is, our job, point 2, our job is to make it better. Remember that. How does the Master define faithfulness? Faithfulness isn't, here, I'm giving this to you, take good care of it and make sure you don't lose it. In fact, the person that did that was called worthless, right? You worthless servant. That's not what stewardship is. The right thing is to take what God has given us and to do something with it so that it becomes something better. Humanity was placed in the garden from the beginning. Another sermon. Humanity was placed in the garden from the beginning to work the soil. You thought it was all vacation till humanity sinned, didn't you? We were created to work from the start. It's just our work wasn't supposed to be as frustrating as it has gotten. That's what sin has ruined. Creation now fights against us rather than cooperating with us. But from the beginning, God, to dress it, to cultivate it, that means to make it more fruitful, to make it better, to help it produce. There was no garden not just because there was no rain yet, there was no garden because there was no human to work the soil. We're created to take God's creation and make it better. It's not just a task of maintenance. Our calling is a calling to multiplication. So the manual reminds us, we're take what God has given us and use it for God's greater purposes. And we're also reminded from this story and from the manual statement that what we do now has repercussions for eternity. Some people argue that what we do with the earth doesn't really matter because the earth is destined for destruction. Right? I mean, at the end of time, the earth will soon dissolve like snow, the sun forbear to shine, right? The elements will dissolve in the heat. It's all going to go away. Why does it matter? The servants could have said the same thing. Now, what is 4 months' wages when you've been given an entire kingdom? This is just a small thing, temporary thing. It doesn't, in the big picture, this doesn't matter. You might as well use it however you want because we're going to get a new one pretty soon anyway, right? But Jesus tells us that our faithfulness in small matters qualifies us for larger service. And the opposite is also true. Our unfaithfulness in small matters disqualifies us from greater responsibility. What we do with God's creation right now speaks into eternity. The way we steward His creation right now is not just something that we do to pass our time until we get there. This right now is practice for what is yet to come. Don't you know that you will rule in the kingdom, Jesus says? Don't you know, Paul says, that you will judge angels, you will rule. So the way we rule over His creation is practice for the greater responsibility one day we're going to have. And so we would do well to consider carefully the pragmatics of the way we work in the world. God has given us this creation, and he said, pragmatuomai, do something with it. We would do well to consider the pragmatics of the ways that we live and work in our world, avoiding the dangers of pollution, defiling what he's given us, avoiding the dangers of unnecessary consumption, wasting what he's given us. And be mindful of our calling to steward his creation for the glory of God and for the good of the world.